The end of the 1700s was a remarkably tumultuous time. The ideas that had been fomenting for more than 100 years were starting to take root. The French, eager to form a republic with a written constitution, launched a bloody revolution that ended with not just a rejection of monarchy, but also the rejection of the Christian faith. Members of the clergy were exiled by the tens of thousands, and many were actually put to death. Churches were seized and converted into temples of reason, including Notre Dame in Paris. Women were dressed as pagan goddesses and paraded through the streets as the goddess of reason. It was a godless revolution, and it ended very badly. But across the sea in the New World, another revolution had taken place, and it had a completely different flavor. In fact, it was anything but godless. The founders of the American Republic felt very strongly that the birth of this nation had been guided by God Himself. And looking back at everything that happened, it's very easy to see why someone might think that. Just look at the long string of historical events that all had to fall into place at exactly the right time. We began this study with the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin and the fall of Constantinople to the Turks. That prompted Christopher Columbus to examine Bible prophecy, and that gave him the overwhelming sense that God was sending him westward over the ocean to hasten the coming of Christ. Then, at about the same time, the printing press was invented, which spurred the wide distribution of new ideas all across Europe. The Bible became available in the common language of the people, which drove thousands to study the Scriptures for themselves. That, in turn, drove English dissenters to flee to the Netherlands, where they came in contact with Jews who were fleeing the Inquisition. And that opened up a whole new realm of political thought. The notion that God had given the Israelites an ideal form of government. Then a mysterious wind suddenly drives the Mayflower off course to a place where the Pilgrims would not be impeded by the colonial governments of the Old World or be influenced by other settlers. It all seems too convenient. And when the Continental Army took up arms against the British in the 1770s, somehow they managed to defeat the most feared, most disciplined military force in the world against all conceivable odds. Consider the words of George Washington at his inauguration on April 30, 1789. Looking back on everything that had happened, he recognized that none of it was a coincidence.
No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand by which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency.
At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Benjamin Franklin expressed the same sense of awe.
I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid?
Every time George Washington's Continental Army was cornered, doomed to failure in the face of much more powerful redcoats, something would always happen to turn the tide in their favor. For example, consider what happened in Boston, March of 1776. Both Washington and the British knew the strategic importance of Dorchester Heights because from this position, you could clearly see and possibly control the city and outer harbor. Both sides had considered taking control of this strategic location, but Neither had done so until Washington hatched a plan. On the night of March 4, Brigadier General John Thomas, with 2,000 of his men, quietly marched to the top of Dorchester Heights under cover of darkness. Without attracting any attention, they managed to move prefabricated fortifications and cannons into place above the city. Unbelievably, by 4 in the morning, they had built a defensive position. When the British woke up the next morning, they were horrified to see Washington's men commanding the hills above the city. As one soldier told a London newspaper,
"This morning, at daybreak, we discovered 2 redoubts on the hills of Dorchester Point, and 2 smaller works on their flanks. They were all raised during the night, with an expedition equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp. From these hills they command the whole town, so that we must drive them from their post, or desert the place."
They knew they had no choice but to react. So General William Howe gathered thousands of his men to retake the heights, and his plan was to do it in darkness like Washington had done. There was no question they could easily drive the Americans from this new position. But that night, the night of March 5, clear weather suddenly gave rise to a horrible storm. One of Washington's men actually described it as a hurricane. In the harbor, the winds became fierce enough to pull up the anchors of ships, and 2 of them were blown ashore, making it impossible to deliver troops by boat. Freezing rain and sleet started to coat the hill with ice, making it impossible for General Howe's men to reach the fortifications. Now the Americans had all the time in the world to strengthen their new position, and by the next day, General Howe was convinced that taking the heights was futile. Now, if that was the only story we had, you might chalk it up to coincidence. But time and time again, something would happen. The weather would change, or something else to bring victory to the ragtag patriots, who by all rights should have lost. A deep fog that settled on Manhattan, making it possible for George Washington to suddenly evacuate 9,000 men without being detected, or a servant determined to betray the American general suddenly arrested by British mercenaries who didn't speak English, so that his message was never delivered. There was no reason for the colonies to win, and yet they did. And the people who were there became convinced that God had won the Republic for them. And they knew the ideas that gave birth to the nation had also come from God. Now, it's true, they had also consulted the great writings of the past and had studied a number of other republics. But the ideas that worked, the ideas that stuck, were the ideas they got from the Bible. Noah Webster, in his History of America, wrote this:
The brief exposition of the Constitution of the United States will unfold to young persons the principles of republican government, and it is the sincere desire of the writer that our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct republican principles is the Bible.
It wasn't just the Revolutionary War that seemed miraculous to these folks. The Constitutional Convention here in Philadelphia was another miracle, pulling together the aspirations of 13 colonies into a single vision. As hot as the weather was when the delegates gathered here in Independence Hall, the tempers of the men gathered inside was often even hotter. Half a year later, in Federalist Paper 37, James Madison expressed his shock that it had actually all come together.
The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with an unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on this circumstance without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to receive in it a finger of that almighty hand which has been so frequently and signally extended to our relief. in the critical stages of the revolution.
So just how hot was the debate? Well, hot enough that it almost all fell apart. One of the most contentious issues had to do with state representation at the federal level. They couldn't decide. Would each state get an equal number of delegates, or would it be based on population? That debate almost scuttled the whole exercise. But then on June 28, Ben Franklin suddenly stood up and, quoting the Bible by memory something like 10 times in a few minutes, he made an impassioned plea to the chair, George Washington, that they stop and appeal to God to help them.
In the situation of this assembly grouping, as it were, in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who are engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we now imagine that we no longer need its assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men.
That last phrase was not just an expression of faith, but also a clear allusion to the book of Daniel, where God had outlined the course of world history in advance. The men who met that summer in Independence Hall were students of the Bible, and they had a keen sense that God had brought them to this point, to the birth of a new republic where people could live free and worship God however they saw fit, or, for that matter, not worship God at all. There would be no king running the church, and there would be no state religion compelling anyone to worship against conscience. Not that all of the Founding Fathers were what you and I might consider born-again, Bible-believing Christians, at least in the modern sense. Some of them were skeptical that all of the Bible was inspired. But even those skeptics had to admit something had happened, something special in the birth of America. There was just no other way to explain it. Someone had obviously intervened. Even Thomas Paine, the notorious critic of the Bible, still recognized its superior moral principles, even appealing to the story of Israel's request for a king to convince people that they should reject the idea of a monarchy.
As the exalting one man, so greatly above the rest, cannot be justified on the equal rights of nature, so neither can it be defended on the authority of Scripture. For the will of the Almighty, as declared by Gideon and the prophet Samuel, expressly disapproves of government by kings.
What was the difference between the French Revolution and its American counterpart? Well, to a large extent, it was the Bible. The fact is that the American people were remarkably literate compared to their European counterparts, and it was a literacy that essentially grew out of their love for the Scriptures. The great French observer and fan of American democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote that even the most humble American
wears the dress, and he speaks the language of cities. He is acquainted with the past, curious of the future, and ready for argument upon the present. He is, in short, a highly civilized being, who consents for a time to inhabit the backwoods, and who penetrates into the wilds of the New World with the Bible, an axe, and a file of newspapers.
This was the secret of America's greatness. She was a free nation built on Christian principles. Not a theocracy like the Old World or even some of the failed experiments in New England, but a nation that was modeled on the concept of the Hebrew Republic, where men and women would be directly answerable to God Himself. You didn't have to address your prayers through a state church, and you didn't have to worship the way the king demanded, because you were free to enter into a relationship with God the way you believed it should happen. That's what we mean when we say that America is a Christian nation, or at least that's what we used to mean. Unfortunately, some of us have forgotten our roots, and we're tempted to think that maybe if we just seize the reins of government, we can force people to be good. But it's tragically flawed thinking, the kind of thinking that made the old world a mess. In 1785, James Madison underscored that point.
Torrents of blood have been spilt in the old world by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord by prescribing all difference in religious opinion. Time has at length revealed the true remedy. Every relaxation of narrow and rigorous policy, wherever it has been tried, has been found to assuage the disease.
In other words, if the church marries the state like it did after Constantine, people will die if they don't have the right opinion. What solves that, said Madison, is to remove Caesar from the church and let people decide for themselves how they want to worship. So the question should be asked, if Bible prophecy saw all those world empires from Babylon to Rome, and it saw the rise of religious intolerance in Western Europe, what about the United States of America? I mean, if this was God's plan, if God had His hand on the rise of this republic, shouldn't you be able to find that in prophecy? The answer is yes. If you remember, Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 showed us the history of the world in advance. In Daniel 2, God used a statue to represent 4 world empires, and the toes pointed forward to the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, the nations of Western Europe. Then in Daniel 7, we find the same thing, but this time, God uses animals rising up out of the sea to make the point. To the Jewish way of thinking, Israel was an island in the middle of a Gentile sea. So these animals were Gentile empires rising up among the nations of the earth. A winged lion for Babylon, a bear for the Medes and Persians, and so on. So what careful students of Bible prophecy have noticed is that you have another animal rising up out of the sea in Revelation 13. And this time, it's one beast with all the body parts of the beast from Daniel 7. It's almost the same thing. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So, if you remember, diligent students in the Middle Ages figured out that the little horn in Daniel 7 was an embarrassing prediction of us and our horrible behavior in the Dark Ages. There's just no way around it. Revelation 13 describes the very same thing, except that it was written 600 years later when most of those kingdoms had passed. But it's all there, including the 10 horns which represent the nations of Europe, right down to the crowns they wear. This is a marriage of church and state. And if you read the rest of the chapter, you get this horrible description of compulsory worship. It fits what we did to a T, including the persecution we conducted against so-called heretics. And you'll notice, it's not Jesus that inspired us to do that. It was the dragon. Now go back 1 chapter, and you'll find that same dragon persecuting God's people described as a woman in Revelation chapter 12. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. So what just happened? The earth opened up to help this woman escape the attacks of the dragon, which is exactly what happened when Columbus felt so compelled to sail west and discover a whole new world. The earth literally opened up and gave us a place to go. And that's the good news. Study these chapters carefully. Go back and read what our forefathers in the Christian faith said about this, and it's obvious. The birth of America really was guided by God Himself. Forget all those sensationalistic books about Bible prophecy on the shelves of most modern stores, and go back and read what Christians said about these chapters for the first 1,800 years of the church's existence, and you'll see it. So, that's the good news. This really was God's idea. But unfortunately, there is more to the story, and every Christian needs to see this. Have a look at Revelation 13, verse 11. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. Now remember, that's the very place the woman went to escape persecution, so that means this second beast appears in the new world. And he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. This second beast has two horns like a lamb. And while the first beast has crowns on his horns, this beast has none. There are no crowns because there is no king. And he looks like a lamb, which is very important because 27 times in the book of Revelation, Jesus is called a lamb, which means that this power is Christ-like, lamb-like. Have a careful look at Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, and you'll notice that animals are always used to represent nations. So what we have is a Christ-like nation rising up in the very place where the persecuted people of Western Europe went to find a brand new life of freedom. And it has no crowns because it has no king. This is a prediction of our nation, the American Republic, which appeared right on time, exactly when and where Bible prophecy said it would. But the disturbing part comes next. At some point, this new nation opens its mouth and speaks like a dragon. So it starts to drift away from its Christ-like roots. In fact, it steers the whole world back to the first beast, this unholy alliance we used to have when we married church to state. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you and I need to have our eyes wide open. The liberties we enjoy right now, we can't afford to take those for granted. We can never forget, when America was born, these ideas about liberty were revolutionary and new. The world had never seen them. Other nations since have copied them, importing many of the best ideas, so we kind of take this way of life for granted all over the world. And if we're honest, we'd have to admit, we haven't always gotten liberty right. It's to our shame, for example, that it took another 70 years to answer the question of slavery, even though faithful Christians did appeal to the founders to do the right thing right at the beginning. But never throw out the baby with the bathwater. Never forget that what you and I enjoy is an historical anomaly. It's only been here for a little more than 200 years. And if we want it to last, we have to pay attention. Because at some point, the world does drift back to what we used to have. Now, of course, the Bible also says that all human government is destined to fail because it all falls way short of the glory of God. The prophecies of Daniel and Revelation make it crystal clear that our only hope ultimately is the kingdom of Christ. That's the whole point of Bible prophecy. The governments we build, the empires we praise, they all end up on the trash heap of history the day Jesus comes to claim his inheritance as the Son of Man. This is the moment the whole universe is waiting for. Then the seventh angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." So, yes, it's going to fail. It's all going to pass away. But right now, in the meantime, we've got something so precious that we can't afford to lose sight of where it came from and what an incredible gift it is. This is the closest we'll get on this side of the second coming to what God has always wanted for us. Is it perfect? No, not by a long shot, but it is a gift from God nonetheless. There's a story from the notes of Dr. James McHenry, one of the youngest delegates present that day. As Benjamin Franklin exited the building, a lady approached him, eager to find out what had just happened. "Well, doctor," she demanded, "what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" There should have been little doubt, I suppose, but Benjamin Franklin answered her. "A republic, madam," he said, "if you can keep it." And that's the challenge more than 200 years later. To keep this gift from God, to cherish it and defend it, to refuse to ever let go of this. In due time, the Bible says we will lose it. Our liberties will be sold for the sake of expediency or globalism or some other crisis. At some point, it is going to happen right before Christ returns. But in the meantime, you and I should refuse to be the generation that ever gives this up.